I feel I should point out that when you have puzzle designs which can cause you to become permanently trapped, you absolutely must have some method of resetting the puzzle. Actually, the whole reason why this situation even happened is because the game resets everything on the board when you die, except for the player's position, thus leading to these kinds of messes under the right circumstances. So some people may feel like I'm cheating with today's Ancient DOS game, Spiritual Warfare, since it's a Christian-themed game, and all the educational components simply come down to answering questions about the Bible. Regardless of if you're a Christian or not, the fact is, this game is quizzing you on things with the expectation that you'll be taught stuff about Christianity in the process. Thus I would definitely qualify that as edutainment. Here's the more surprising thing though. This game's actually not all that bad. It's not particularly great, but it's interesting and entertaining enough that I was willing to sit through the problems I ran into and ultimately reach the end after a little over 5 hours of gameplay. Christian-themed games are notorious, in general, for being poor in quality, although for every 4 or 5 bad Christian games, there's one average or above average one, although I will admit I have yet to run into one I would qualify as great. Actually, another part of the reason why this game's not so bad is because it's blatantly using the original Legend of Zelda formula, all the way down to having a handful of similar items and identical mechanics. Cloning an existing game's methodology isn't necessarily a bad thing, but you need to be unique in at least a few ways to pull it off. And even then, you still run the risk of alienating people, as for some reason, anytime someone tries to make a unique game with any similarities at all to the Zelda games, it generates a massive amount of scorn and hate, often leading to poor sales. Considering Christian games were typically avoided by non-Christians and were difficult to find, often due to being self-published and unlicensed, it's difficult to say if that was a factor for this game. All that said though, it does have quite a few unique aspects and is continually introducing new things even up to the very end, thus it manages to stay interesting, even to someone like myself who is not Christian. And no, playing through this thing didn't convert me into one or anything. All I'm saying is that despite not being Christian, I can still respect the content and the effort. Spiritual Warfare was created by Wisdom Tree, a company with an interesting history as they spawned out of another company known as Color Dreams, known primarily for making unlicensed NES titles, with this particular game being released for the NES in 1992 and for DOS in 1993. It also came out on the Genesis and Game Boy in 1994. It's a one-player Christian-themed adventure game, which primarily supports VGA 320 by 200 256 color graphics, and supposedly has EGA 16 color support, but I can't get it working for whatever reason. Though actually, I'm fairly convinced it doesn't have EGA support, given that the manual doesn't provide any options for manually enabling it. In terms of audio, it primarily supports Sound Blaster cards, but also has PC speaker sound support. Granted, the music is extremely repetitive, given that there's pretty much just one tune throughout the entire game, so you'll probably just want to leave the music off, as I have. As for its current release date, it's still commercial and, believe it or not, still sold by Wisdom Tree as a digital download for $7.50. Yep, even after all this time, the company still seems to exist. Though a part of me suspects it's simply being maintained by this point and that new products are not actively being developed, but I don't know that for certain. Also, don't be confused by the NES screenshot on the storefront page, as you are actually buying the DOS version of the game. And if you'd prefer a physical copy, then you'd better be prepared to shell out a lot of cash, because despite being very common, it's typically sold for outrageous amounts due to the perception that because it's an unlicensed game, it must be ultra rare. Loose NES carts are usually only $15 to $20. Boxed copies of the NES version tend to go for around $30, and everything else, including DOS copies, Genesis copies, and Game Boy copies, tend to go for $40 or more. The rarest physical version by far is the DOS version, followed by the Game Boy version, which I wouldn't actually call all that rare, then the Genesis version, which is about as common as the Game Boy version, and then the NES version is definitely the most common and easiest to find. I should also quickly point out that the NES version of the game can be played for free on the Wisdom Tree website through a browser-based emulator, though getting it working can be a bit of a hassle. Still, it's a good way to try the game out if you're curious about it, especially given that setting up the DOS version has a major hiccup, which we'll talk about later in the episode. And despite some minor differences, the two versions are virtually identical. The object of the game is to find all the pieces of the armor of God, and through its power defeat the Lord's enemies, all while using fruit to help cleanse the spirits of unsaved souls. Now, if that premise seems like a bit of a stretch, that's because it is. But at least everything's tied together and makes sense within itself, which is more than I can say for the first game I covered this month. The controls for the game are pretty much exactly like in The Legend of Zelda. You move around from an overhead view, have a button to use your selected weapon, and a button to use secondary items. However, the DOS version of this game goes one step further by eliminating the need for a sub-menu and scattering all the selection buttons across the keyboard. But for weapons this makes sense, as you use the 1 through 5 keys to select them. For special items, however, the letter keys referencing the names of these items are used, such as S for the sword and B for the vials. Fortunately, you only have to switch your special item selection on rare occasions, as while they all do different things, there's often no reason to rapidly switch between them. While the main screen may look a little intimidating, it's really not all that bad. The top is used to show you your health, your present location, and your score, which is completely arbitrary, so you can just ignore it. The side of the screen from top to bottom shows your spirit points, vials, keys, fruits, special items, and armor pieces. The bottom of the screen is a message bar, which is used in certain situations for talking to bystanders or picking up certain items. Let's talk about spirit points first. They're essentially treated as a form of currency, but the idea is that by being faithful to the Lord and spreading his teachings, you're gaining spirit power to prove your worthiness to acquire certain items. All of the enemies you face, referred to in-game as unsaved souls, are basically people who tend to be doing things which go against God's teachings. Although I think using businessmen and construction workers as some of these unsaved souls might be a bit reaching. Most of them though make sense, such as gang members in the slums, graffiti spraying punks in the housing area, drunkards around the hotels and casinos, those kinds of people. When you hit an unsaved soul with a piece of fruit, the idea is that you're showing them the path to salvation, thus they get down and pray to indicate this, and then disappear because you no longer have to worry about them. When this happens, they sometimes leave behind spirit points for you to collect to improve your faith. Every once in a while, though, an evil spirit will emerge from someone that you've converted. Early in the game, these evil spirits move slow and are easy to deal with, but in later sections, they move much faster, and thus you have to constantly be flinging fruit if you want to avoid getting hit by them. Although, to be honest, getting hit really isn't all that big a deal. I mean, if you run out of health, you simply restart the area you're in with 3 hearts and your current supply of items and spirit points. Now, sometimes though, especially when fighting bosses, running out of health isn't a good idea. In which case, so long as you have at least 10 spirit points, you can pray to regain half a heart. Praying multiple times in a row in a dire situation can really help if dying isn't an option. But remember that if you do die, you don't get those spirit points back. You also have a maximum of 255 spirit points, so if you're close to the maximum, then spending a few to keep going really isn't that big a deal. Now, the actual map for this game is huge and covers multiple different kinds of locations, all of which are taken from what you'd expect from real life. Thus, you have locations like a park, a city, an airport, a shipyard, a prison, and several others, each of which featuring its own unique adversaries and such. The mini-map you can bring up in-game isn't all that helpful, but can at least give you an idea of where you are in relation to everything else. While the gameplay is mostly from an overhead perspective, there are a few places you can go where a faux side-scrolling system is used, thus certain kinds of objects will be affected by gravity, though most won't. And there's also a handful of puzzles done from a purely overhead perspective with no isometric graphics at all, although there's very few spots like this. The last thing to say about the gameplay in general is that every once in a while, though more commonly when you're low on health, you'll see an angel come on screen. Now, touching the angel engages a quiz round for 5 questions. There's no penalty for losing these quizzes or passing up on touching the angel, but you can earn extra spirit points fairly easily, as all the questions are multiple choice and I'll never have more than 3 choices, with some of them simply coming down to true or false. The questions themselves actually have a pretty good variety to them and get harder the further in you get, but they're always presented in the same order every time you play. Now, given that this is more so meant to be an educational aspect of the game and not mere trivia, I don't see this as a problem, though I imagine some people would prefer a completely random question order. Each question you get right is worth 5 spirit points, and if you get all 5 right, you get an additional 5 spirit points and 2 hearts of health. There's actually a pretty good variety of items, but let's start with the fruit, as these serve as your primary means of attack. And there's 5 different kinds of fruit: pears, apples, pomegranates, grapes, and bananas. Pears have very short range, or the only fruit which can't be thrown through solid objects. Apples have medium range and move slowly, but can hit multiple times and can clear away some kinds of rubble. Pomegranates have a narrow zigzag pattern when thrown, and move at a good speed and distance. Since their movement pattern isn't very wide, it actually makes them easier to use than most of the other fruits. Grapes are thrown in a sort of 3-way spreading pattern, and they have decent range. Bananas have the longest range and move very fast, but you don't find them until much later, and they only go perfectly straight. You'll also see numbers next to each fruit to indicate how many you have. And this is basically your shot limit, as the more pieces of a particular kind of fruit you have, the more shots of that fruit can be in the air at any point in time. Now, this crosses over between other fruits too. So if you have 3 apples and fire all 3, then switch to pomegranates when you only have 2 of those, at least 2 apples are going to have to disappear first before you can fire any pomegranates. The locations of the fruit in this game are all fixed, as are almost all of the items you find, and there's a maximum of 4 pieces of each scattered across the map. As for the special items, there's 6. You first get what are referred to as Vials of God's Wrath, which are pretty much the equivalent of Zelda's bombs. Unlike the Zelda games, though, you get very large quantities of these vials and are allowed to drop as many at a time as you wish. Now, while they take a moment to explode on their own, you can shoot them with fruit to make them explode on command. Plus, if a vial's blast hits another vial, it'll create a chain reaction. It's also important to note, though, that while you can't hurt yourself with your own explosions, all other explosions will hurt you, and by quite a bit, too. The next item you're likely to get is Anointing Oil. Basically, these are like the medicine bottles from Zelda, even down to the fact you can only carry 2 doses at once, with each able to refill your health entirely. Next up is Samson's Jawbone, which is kind of like the boomerang from Zelda, except it has no effect on enemies and only affects items. Next is the Raft, which actually doesn't work anything like the Raft from Zelda, as you use it to travel over water in any direction you want, whereas in Zelda, you can only use the Raft to travel between predetermined spots. Next is the Torch, which lights up certain kinds of invisible walls. You can turn it on and off, but once you have it and turn it on, there's no reason to ever turn it off again. Lastly is the Sword of the Spirit, which can basically be thought of as an infinite supply of grenades, which is something Zelda didn't have, I don't think. As each time you toss this sword, it explodes on impact and can be immediately tossed again. Needless to say, it's exceedingly overpowered, and thus you don't get it until very near the end of the game. As for the Armor of God, you get the belt first, which allows you to push certain kinds of objects, then the breastplate, which halves the damage you take, then the boots, which allow you to walk over certain kinds of tiles, then the helmet, which cancels out all explosion damage, then the sword, which technically counts as part of the armor set, even though it's a usable special item, then finally the shield, which not only halves damage again, but also makes you immune to the fireballs shot by the enemies in the final area. Now, I have a few tips and tricks for getting through this game, and my first major tip is to take advantage of item respawns. And just like in Zelda, enemies won't respawn immediately once you leave a screen. You actually have to visit a number of different screens first before enemies will respawn. However, items also respawn this way, and thus taking advantage of this is a good way to build up a supply of keys, anointing oil, vials, etc. Actually, the game has more locked doors than key locations, so you absolutely must take advantage of this if you want to unlock every door in the game. My next tip is to avoid what this game considers to be sinful places. In the city there's a bar, and around the hotels there's a casino. Stepping foot into either of these places will deprive you of a piece of your armor, and the only way to get it back is to visit the pawn shop in the slums and spend a huge amount of spirit points on them to get them back. This may seem like some kind of side quest, it really is nothing more than a major inconvenience, so just don't go in those places. My next tip is to take advantage of the railroads to get around faster. Granted, you don't have access to the railroads until over halfway into the game. There's other hidden shortcuts too you should keep your eyes open for, though some of these shortcuts have various barriers which can only be overcome with the right items or armor pieces. In terms of attacking enemies, one good thing to keep in mind is that, unlike in other versions of this game, in this DOS version, you get auto-fire. So all you have to do to continually attack is hold the fire button down, since pressing it rapidly won't actually fire it any faster. I actually have a very important tip for dealing with the save files. There's a bit of a bug with the saving and loading system if you try to use it from the options menus. To avoid any issues, always save and load games using the shortcut keys. If you use the options menu, it'll show the save file list fine, but you'll actually be accessing an entirely different set of save files, not the ones indicated. Nor will you be able to assign names to those save files since, again, you're seeing the proper list of saves, not this alternate list you somehow have access to. Loading from the main menu accesses the proper list of saves. So if you accidentally saved your game using the options menu, just start a new game, then load the game from the options menu to continue. Finally, this game seems specifically designed for players to try all kinds of things when searching for secrets. Some of the secrets I've found have been completely by accident, and given the fact that I didn't end the game with all the fruits, I'm absolutely positive I missed several secrets, despite how well I searched for them. Basically, just like with the Zelda games, if you search around hard enough, you can get yourself extremely well equipped. Overall, Spiritual Warfare is probably one of the best Christian-themed games out there, if only because the actual educational aspect is fairly uncommon, direct, simple, and doesn't inhibit your progress if you mess it up. As far as gameplay is concerned, it follows the Zelda formula very closely, but is still unique in its presentation and runs surprisingly well on period-correct hardware. Even if you're not Christian, there's a lot to like about this game, but then it's nowhere near perfect given the potential for game-ending design snafus, its extremely repetitive music, and again, its extreme similarity to the original Legend of Zelda. And I guess whether you want to play it or not really does just come down to curiosity. And I'd say if you're curious about it, then it's probably worth your time and money. But if you have no interest at all, regardless of the reason, then playing it probably wouldn't change that opinion. Setting this game up in DOSBox requires you to set a fixed cycles count, with 10,000 being the best rate to go with. And also requires that you turn off timed intervals if you intend to use a joystick or gamepad. You may also want to turn off button wrap, given that only the first two buttons are used by the game, and you may want to use DOSBox's keymapper to give you additional buttons on your joystick or gamepad for things like praying, selecting weapons or special items, and stuff like that. However, there's two very important configuration details we need to address, neither of which have to do with DOSBox directly. The first is that while the game is entirely DOS-based, the installer is a 16-bit Windows 3.1 program. This means that if you want to get this game working, you need to either have some way of running old Windows 3.1 software, or you need a method of accessing the contents of those installers. Me personally, I just emulated my copy of Windows 3.1 in DOSBox and got the game installed in that manner. But this is important because if you can't do any of this, then you're not going to be able to play the game. The other important thing to note is that when you start playing the game for your first time, the game speed will be extremely fast. All you need to do is press F5 and you'll get a menu with a single slider. Press enter to access the slider and push it all the way to the left side. This will slow the game speed down to sync with the monitor refresh rate, thus providing you with the exact speed the game should be played at. The reason for running with a fixed cycles count though is actually to balance the frame rate properly, since you'll get stuttering effects or other graphical glitches if the cycles count is too low or too high. There's also code sheet copy protection to worry about in the DOS version, which is kind of ironic when you think about it. But in any case, the code sheet is included as a Microsoft Word doc file in the downloadable version. But it's something to keep in mind if you're looking to buy a physical copy. Anywho, that's all for episode 160 of Ancient DOS Games. Season 4 seems to be off to a good start, at least as far as the games are concerned. So far, the only major hiccups have been temporarily losing access to all of my stuff, having to switch everything over ASAP to YouTube because Blip is shutting down at some unknown point this year, and getting sick when I was trying to make this video. Life can be funny sometimes. Episode 161 will be on Saturday, May 2nd, and I'll be taking a look at the sequel to an FMV game. Yeah, not a lot of options as far as DOS is concerned, so make sure you send your guests to adg@pixelships.com and stay tuned to see just what game I've got lined up for you guys.